This 1895 photo holds a secret that historians have never been able to unravel, until now. The auction house in Charleston smelled of old paper and forgotten memories. Sarah Bennett moved slowly through rows of dusty boxes, her trained eyes scanning for anything worth preserving. As a historian specializing in post-Civil War America, she had learned that the most important stories often hid in the most unlikely places. It was nearly closing time when she found it, a small wooden frame tucked beneath a pile of Victorian-era magazines. The photograph inside stopped her cold. The image showed a wedding scene from 1895, based on the clothing and photographic style. A white man stood stiffly in a formal black suit, his hand resting on an ornate chair. Beside him, a black woman wore an elaborate white wedding dress with intricate lace details that must have cost a fortune. But what made Sarah's breath catch was the veil. It didn't just frame the bride's face, it covered it completely, cascading down like a white curtain, hiding every feature. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she held the frame closer to the light. In 1895, interracial marriage was illegal in South Carolina and nearly every other state. The existence of this photograph shouldn't be possible. She examined every detail with growing fascination. The bride's posture was rigid, almost defensive. Her right hand, visible beneath the veil's edge, was clenched into a tight fist. The groom stared directly at the camera with an expression that was difficult to read. Was it defiance? Pride? Fear? The background was deliberately plain, just a painted backdrop of generic scenery. No family members, no guests, no celebration. Just two people standing before a camera, documenting something that could have destroyed both their lives. Sarah turned the frame over carefully. On the back, written in faded ink, were only two words: Providence Church. Her mind raced. Providence Church, she knew that name. It had been a stop on the Underground Railroad, a place where abolitionists had gathered even after the Civil War ended. But this photograph was taken 30 years after emancipation. Why would a couple need to hide in 1895? She purchased the photograph immediately, barely registering the price. As she walked out into the humid Charleston evening, the frame clutched against her chest, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something far more significant than a simple wedding portrait. Somewhere in this image was a story that had been deliberately hidden for over a century, a woman whose face had been concealed for reasons Sarah couldn't yet understand, a marriage that defied the laws of an entire nation. And Sarah was determined to uncover every secret this photograph held. Sarah spread the photograph across her research desk at the university, positioning 3 high-powered lamps around it. Through her magnifying glass, details invisible to the naked eye began to emerge. The quality of the photograph was exceptional for 1895. The focus sharp, the exposure perfectly balanced. This hadn't been taken by an amateur. Whoever documented this moment knew exactly what they were doing and had access to expensive equipment. She examined the bride's dress more carefully. The lace pattern was French Alençon, extraordinarily expensive even for wealthy families. The cut of the dress followed the latest Paris fashion, with leg of mutton sleeves and a dramatic train visible pooling at the bride's feet. This wasn't a simple ceremony. Someone had invested serious money in this wedding. But it was the veil that fascinated Sarah most. Unlike typical bridal veils of the era, which were sheer enough to see through, this one was made of thick, white silk that completely obscured the bride's features. It wasn't a fashion choice, it was intentional concealment. Sarah moved to the groom. His suit was equally expensive, custom-tailored with silk lapels. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. A gold watch chain stretched across his vest. This was a man of means, not someone operating in the shadows. Then she noticed something that made her pulse quicken. On the small table beside the groom, partially hidden behind the chair, sat a leather-bound book. Sarah adjusted the magnifying glass, straining to see more detail. The book's cover bore a symbol, a compass, rose intertwined with an olive branch. She had seen that symbol before. Sarah rushed to her bookshelf and pulled down a volume on secret societies in post-Civil War America. She flipped through pages frantically until she found it. The same symbol, belonging to the Brotherhood of Providence, a clandestine organization of abolitionists, freed slaves, and progressive white allies who continued fighting for racial equality long after the war ended. They had operated through a network of churches, including Providence Church. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind spinning. This wasn't just a forbidden wedding photograph. This was documentation of something organized, something protected by people with resources and connections. The veil wasn't hiding the bride from the camera. It was hiding her from anyone who might see the photograph later, protecting her identity from those who would seek revenge or retribution. But why? If the Brotherhood protected this couple, if they had money and support, why such extreme measures? Sarah looked again at the bride's clenched fist, at the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't just a bride on her wedding day. She was a woman in danger, and Sarah was going to find out why. The ruins of Providence Church sat on the outskirts of Charleston, hidden behind a thick wall of live oaks draped in Spanish moss. Sarah navigated her car down an overgrown dirt road, consulting the historical maps she had printed the night before. The church had burned down in 1923, according to records, but the stone foundation remained. Sarah parked and walked carefully through the tall grass, her camera bag slung over her shoulder. The foundation outlined a modest building, perhaps 30 feet long. Blackened stones marked where the fire had consumed the wooden structure. But beneath an ancient magnolia tree, Sarah found what she was looking for, a small cemetery with weathered headstones. She moved between the graves, slowly, photographing each stone, noting names and dates. Most were from the 1860s and 1870s, freed slaves who had found community here after the war. But one grave made her stop completely. The headstone read, Reverend Thomas Whitfield, 1848 to 1899. He married those the law would not. Sarah knelt beside the grave, her hands resting on the warm stone. This was the man who had performed the ceremony. A white minister, willing to break the law, willing to unite couples that society deemed illegal. She pulled out her phone and called her colleague Marcus, a genealogist who specialized in African American history. Marcus, I need help finding records for Reverend Thomas Whitfield, Providence Church, Charleston, specifically around 1895. Whitfield? Marcus's voice crackled through the phone. Sarah, that name is legendary in certain circles. He married over 200 interracial couples between 1870 and his death. He was arrested at least a dozen times. The Brotherhood always paid his bail. Sarah's excitement grew. Did he keep records? If he did, they'd be hidden. Keeping those records would have been evidence for prosecution, but Marcus paused. There's a woman you should talk to, Eleanor Whitfield James. She's Thomas Whitfield's great-great-granddaughter, lives in Columbia. She's been the family historian for decades. Sarah was already walking back to her car. Can you get me her contact information? I'll text it to you now. But Sarah, be careful with this. Some families don't want these stories brought into the light. There's still shame attached, still fear. Sarah looked back at the ruined church, at the graves of people who had risked everything for love and dignity. I'll be respectful, but this story deserves to be told. As she drove away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was following a path that had been deliberately obscured for over a century. Every record destroyed, every name forgotten, every face hidden, all to protect people whose only crime was loving across the color line. But someone had wanted this photograph to survive. They had hidden the bride's face but preserved the image itself. They had left clues, the symbol, the church name, the quality of the photograph, as if knowing that someday someone would come looking for the truth. Sarah was that someone, and she was just getting started. Eleanor Whitfield James lived in a historic home in Columbia's Waverly neighborhood. At 78, she moved with deliberate grace, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She welcomed Sarah into a living room lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves. Marcus told me you found one of my great-great-grandfather's photographs, Eleanor said, settling into a worn leather chair. May I see it? Sarah carefully removed the frame from her bag and placed it in Eleanor's hands. The older woman's expression shifted immediately, her eyes widening, her breath catching. Oh, my lord, Eleanor whispered. I never thought I'd see this one. You know this photograph? Sarah leaned forward eagerly. Eleanor nodded slowly, her fingers tracing the frame's edge. My great-great-grandfather kept a secret ledger. It was passed down through our family, hidden away. When I inherited it 15 years ago, I read every entry. This couple, they were the most dangerous wedding he ever performed. She stood carefully and walked to a locked cabinet in the corner. From inside, she retrieved a leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. She opened it to a marked page and handed it to Sarah. The handwriting was precise, dated September 14th, 1895. Today I married J.H. and R., the most perilous union I have ever blessed. R. is not merely a freed woman. She is the daughter of Senator Morrison's household, raised alongside his own children, educated in secret by his late wife. When Mrs. Morrison died last year, the senator planned to sell R. South to distant relatives, erasing any trace of his wife's defiance of social order. J.H., a Boston merchant with Brotherhood connections, offered marriage and escape. But the senator has powerful friends. If R's identity becomes known, both will hang. I photographed them at J.H.'s insistence. He wants proof of their love, proof that they stood before God as equals. But I concealed R's face completely. The veil protects her. Should this image ever fall into the wrong hands, they leave tonight on the Northern Railway. God protect them both. Sarah read the entry 3 times, her heart pounding. The bride wasn't just any black woman. She was someone whose very existence threatened powerful people. Senator Morrison? Sarah said slowly. I know that name. He was one of the architects of South Carolina's Jim Crow laws. Eleanor nodded grimly. He spent his entire political career fighting against racial equality, but his wife Elizabeth had been an abolitionist. She educated the daughter of their cook in secret, taught her to read and write, treated her like family. When Elizabeth died, Morrison wanted to erase all evidence of his wife's betrayal. But this woman escaped, Sarah said, with the Brotherhood's help, and with a man brave enough to marry her despite the consequences. Eleanor's eyes were bright with emotion. My great-great-grandfather performed over 200 illegal marriages, but he said this one kept him awake at night for years. He feared Morrison's reach would find them. Sarah looked at the photograph with new understanding. The bride's clenched fist, the groom's tense posture. They weren't just nervous newlyweds. They were fugitives documenting the most dangerous moment of their lives. "Do you know what happened to them?" Sarah asked quietly. Eleanor closed the journal carefully. "That's where the trail goes cold. My great-great-grandfather never recorded their names in full, never knew where they went, for their protection and his." Sarah stared at the photograph. Somewhere beneath that veil was a woman who had defied one of the most powerful men in South Carolina. A woman educated in secret, loved in defiance of the law, married in a ceremony that could have killed everyone involved. Finding her identity would be dangerous even now, but Sarah was already too deep to turn back. Sarah spent the next 3 days buried in the South Carolina State Archives, searching for any trace of Senator Morrison and his household. The more she discovered, the darker the story became. Senator Charles Morrison had been a prominent figure in post-Reconstruction South Carolina, serving from 1885 until his death in 1904. His political career was built on white supremacy. He had authored legislation segregating schools, restricting black voting rights, and criminalizing interracial marriage with increasingly harsh penalties. But his wife, Elizabeth Morrison, had been different. Sarah found her name in abolitionist society records from before the Civil War. Elizabeth had been born in Massachusetts, daughter of a prominent preacher who had sheltered escaped slaves. When she married Morrison in 1863, a political alliance between families, she brought her convictions south with her. Newspaper society columns from the 1870s and 1880s mentioned Elizabeth Morrison's peculiar household management, her unusual charity toward her servants, and her regrettable progressive sympathies. One particularly vicious editorial from 1889 suggested that Mrs. Morrison failed to understand the natural order of Southern society. Then Sarah found Elizabeth's obituary from April 1894. She had died suddenly at age 52. The funeral had been small, private. Senator Morrison had declined to give any public statement beyond expressing his grief. 3 months after her death, Senator Morrison had terminated the employment of his entire household staff, an unusual move that sparked gossip in Charleston's social circles. The servants had been redistributed to various positions throughout the state, according to one newspaper account, with no forwarding information provided. Sarah sat back, the pieces coming together. Elizabeth dies. Morrison immediately dismantles her household, scattering the people his wife had protected. And somewhere in that household had been a young woman Morrison wanted gone completely, the educated daughter his wife had raised in defiance of everything he believed. She searched employment records, census data, anything that might list Morrison's household staff. Finally, in the 1890 census, she found it. Morrison household, Charleston. Charles Morrison, 44. Elizabeth Morrison, 48. Household staff: Martha, 32, cook. Rachel, 17, daughter of Martha, domestic servant. Rachel, age 17 in 1890, which would make her 22 in 1895, the right age for the bride in the photograph. But census records only gave first names for black household servants. Finding Rachel's full identity would require diving deeper into records that most historians avoided: the bills of sale, property records, and legal documents that treated human beings as commodities. Sarah's phone rang. It was Marcus. "I've been digging into the Brotherhood of Providence," he said without preamble. "They kept their own records, coded and hidden. I found a contact who has access to their archives, a private collection held by a family in Boston. They're willing to let you see the documents, but you have to go there in person. No photographs, no copies." "When can I go?" Sarah asked immediately. "Tomorrow, if you can get there. But Sarah," Marcus's voice grew serious, "this family is protective of these records for a reason. The Brotherhood protected people whose descendants are still alive, still living with the consequences of their ancestors' courage. Tread carefully." Sarah looked at the photograph on her desk, at the veiled bride whose identity had been protected for 129 years. "I will, I promise." That night, Sarah booked a flight to Boston. She was close now, she could feel it. Rachel, daughter of Martha, raised by Elizabeth Morrison, educated in secret, married to a mysterious Boston merchant with Brotherhood connections. But questions still remained. Why had the Brotherhood considered this wedding so dangerous? What made Rachel such a threat to Senator Morrison? And most importantly, had she survived? The Brotherhood archives were kept in a townhouse in Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, maintained by the descendants of James Hartwell, one of the organization's founding members. His great-great-grandson, David Hartwell, greeted Sarah at the door. "You're the historian Marcus told me about," David said. leading her through elegant hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The one looking into the 1895 wedding. "You know about it?" Sarah asked, surprised. David nodded as he unlocked a heavy wooden door. "My ancestor performed that wedding. He's the J.H. in Reverend Whitfield's ledger. James Hartwell, Boston merchant, Brotherhood leader, and apparently brave enough to marry a woman whose very existence threatened one of South Carolina's most powerful senators." Sarah's excitement surged. "You're descended from the groom?" "I am." David led her into a climate-controlled room filled with filing cabinets and document boxes. "And I've been waiting years for someone to come asking the right questions about that photograph." He pulled out a leather portfolio and opened it carefully on the table. Inside were letters, all written in the same flowing handwriting. James Hartwell corresponded regularly with the Brotherhood's Southern operatives, David explained. He traveled to Charleston 4 times between 1894 and 1895, ostensibly on business, but these letters reveal his true purpose. Sarah read the first letter, dated May 1894. The situation with E.M.'s protege grows desperate. The senator plans to separate her from her mother and send her to his brother's plantation in Mississippi after E.M.'s death. The girl is educated beyond what any white woman in Charleston has received. She speaks 3 languages, has read extensively, and possesses a mind that should not be wasted in servitude. E.M. has begged us to help. I am considering a radical solution. The next letter was from August 1894. I have met the girl. Her name is Rachel, though E.M. called her by her middle name, Catherine, in private. A small dignity in an undignified situation. She is 21, intelligent, and terrified. The senator watches her constantly since his wife's death. He knows what she represents, proof of his wife's betrayal of Southern values. If she remains, she will be silenced permanently one way or another. Sarah's hands trembled as she read. This wasn't just about an illegal marriage. This was a rescue operation. The September 1895 letter made everything clear. I proposed marriage to Catherine, Rachel, yesterday. Not from romantic love, I'm 42, she's 22, but from conviction that she deserves the protection my name and wealth can provide. She accepted, understanding our arrangement. We will marry in secret at Providence Church, then travel north immediately. She will take my name, assume a new identity, and finally live free. The senator must never find her. The Brotherhood will ensure our tracks are covered completely. David watched Sarah's expression as she processed the information. My great-great-grandfather wasn't in love with her, he said quietly. He was protecting her, giving her freedom through a marriage that was equal parts legal shield and escape route. Did it work? Sarah asked urgently. Did they make it? David pulled out another document, a marriage certificate dated September 15, 1895, signed by Reverend Thomas Whitfield. The groom's name was listed as James William Hartwell. The bride's name was listed as Catherine Rachel Hartwell, formerly Catherine Rachel Turner. Turner was her mother Martha's surname, David explained. Elizabeth Morrison had it legally recorded when Rachel was born, ensuring she had a free identity separate from the Morrison household. It was Martha's maiden name, a small act of dignity. Sarah stared at the certificate, Catherine Rachel Turner. Finally, a full name, a real identity behind the veil. They arrived in Boston in late September 1895, David continued. James set her up in a separate residence initially. Their marriage was legal protection, not a traditional union. He supported her education, helped her establish her own life. The Brotherhood watched for any sign that Senator Morrison was searching for her, but he never publicly acknowledged her disappearance. To admit she existed would be to admit his wife's defiance. And what happened to Catherine? Sarah asked, almost afraid of the answer. David smiled, the first genuine smile since Sarah arrived. That's the beautiful part, and it's a story that deserves to be told carefully. He pulled out one more document, and Sarah's breath caught. It was a photograph, dated 1898, showing the same man from the wedding photograph, James Hartwell, standing beside a young black woman whose face was finally gloriously visible. Catherine Rachel Hartwell stared directly at the camera with fierce, intelligent eyes, her expression one of hard-won dignity and unmistakable pride. She had survived. David spread more photographs across the table, each one a window into Catherine's life after the wedding. Sarah studied each image hungrily, finally able to see the woman who had been hidden behind the veil. Catherine had strong, elegant features, high cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and a direct gaze that suggested someone who had survived impossible circumstances and emerged determined. In every photograph, she wore fashionable clothing that would have cost a fortune, but her expression never quite relaxed. Even in freedom, Sarah could see the shadow of fear. James kept his promise, David explained. He set her up in a house in Roxbury, introduced her to Boston society as his wife from Charleston. Some people accepted it, many didn't, but James had enough money and social standing that people couldn't ignore them completely. Sarah found a photograph from 1896, showing Catherine at a desk surrounded by books. She continued her education. She became fluent in French, German, and Italian. She studied literature, history, and eventually began teaching other young black women in Boston's community. By 1900, she was running her own small school. David's pride in his ancestor's wife was evident. Elizabeth Morrison had given her the foundation. James gave her the protection and resources. But Catherine built her own life through her own determination. Did James and Catherine were they ever truly married beyond the legal protection? Sarah asked delicately. David shook his head. According to family records, no. They maintained separate residences until James's death in 1910. He never remarried, and he left her half his considerable estate, a fortune that allowed her to expand her school and support dozens of other families escaping the South. And Catherine? Did she ever marry again? David pulled out another photograph, this one from 1912. Catherine stood beside a tall black man in a formal suit, both of them smiling genuinely. She married Dr. Marcus Thompson in 1911, a year after James died. Thompson was a prominent physician in Boston, one of the few black doctors in the city. They were married for 32 years until his death in 1943. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. Catherine had gotten her happy ending, not just survival, but a full, rich life. Did she ever go back to South Carolina? Sarah asked. Never. Senator Morrison died in 1904, but Catherine never risked returning. Her mother, Martha, was brought north by the Brotherhood in 1897, and they lived together until Martha's death in 1920. Catherine spent her entire life terrified that someone would discover who she really was, where she came from. David opened a wooden box and removed a small leather journal. This is Catherine's diary from 1895 to 1900. She donated it to the Brotherhood archives before her death in 1962, with specific instructions that it could only be opened after all her children and grandchildren had passed. The last of her descendants died in 2019. This is the first time anyone outside our family has been allowed to read it. He handed it to Sarah carefully. She wanted the truth told, but only when it was safe, when no one could be hurt by Senator Morrison's legacy or the scandal of her escape. She waited a century for her story to be safe. Sarah opened the journal with trembling hands. The first entry was dated September 14th, 1895, the wedding day. Today I married a man I barely know to escape a future I cannot survive. Mrs. Morrison, my teacher, my protector, the closest thing to a mother beyond my own, is gone. The senator plans to erase every trace of her kindness, including me. James Hartwell says he can give me freedom, but I wonder if I will ever truly be free of fear. The photographer asked me to remove my veil for just one portrait, so I might see my own face on my wedding day. I refused. I cannot risk anyone knowing what I look like, cannot risk the senator finding me. So I will be a bride without a face, a woman without an identity, until I reach safety. If I reach safety. Sarah looked up at David, her vision blurred with tears. She was so afraid. She had every right to be, David said quietly, but she survived. And now, 129 years later, she can finally be seen. While Catherine's story had ended in survival and eventual peace, Sarah discovered that Senator Morrison's search for her had been far more extensive and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Back in Charleston, Sarah met with a local historian named James Crawford, who specialized in the darker aspects of Reconstruction-era politics. When she explained what she had learned about Catherine and Senator Morrison, his expression grew grim. Morrison didn't just let her go, James said, pulling out a box of documents from his personal collection. I've been researching his political career for years, and there are gaps in the records, destroyed documents, missing correspondence. I always suspected he was hiding something significant. He spread papers across his desk, private letters Morrison had written to associates, newspaper clippings, and police reports. In October 1895, 1 month after Catherine's escape, Morrison hired private detectives from the Pinkerton Agency. The contract was for recovery of stolen property, his way of describing a human being. James handed Sarah a yellowed report. The Pinkertons searched Charleston, Columbia, Atlanta, and Richmond. They questioned Martha, Catherine's mother, multiple times. According to these reports, Martha claimed her daughter had died suddenly of fever and been buried in a pauper's grave outside the city. Sarah felt a chill. Martha lied to protect her. And paid the price. Look at this. James showed her another document, an arrest record from November 1895. Martha had been charged with providing false information to authorities and spent 3 months in jail. Morrison wanted her punished for helping Catherine escape. The Pinkerton reports continued through 1896, each one documenting dead ends. The detectives traced the Brotherhood's network but never made the connection to Boston. James Hartwell's name appeared once as a textile merchant from the north who visited Charleston on business, but he was never investigated further. Morrison was obsessed, James continued. Look at this letter from 1897. Sarah read Morrison's words, written to a political ally. The escaped girl represents more than disobedience. She represents evidence of my late wife's betrayal of our entire social structure. She was educated as a white woman, treated as an equal, given ideas far beyond her station. If her existence becomes known, if she tells her story, it validates everything our opponents claim about the humanity and capability of the Negro race. She must be found and silenced. Sarah felt sick. Catherine hadn't just been fleeing servitude, she had been fleeing elimination. Did he ever find out she went to Boston? Sarah asked. James shook his head. There's no evidence he tracked her there. The Brotherhood was too careful. But Morrison never stopped looking, not until his death in 1904. And even after he died, his sons continued the search sporadically for several more years. He pulled out one final document, a letter from Morrison's oldest son to the Pinkerton Agency, dated 1908. While my father has passed, the family wishes to locate the girl Catherine for closure of certain legal matters regarding property and inheritance from my late grandmother's estate. Any information would be appreciated. Property and inheritance? Sarah read aloud. What property? That's the thing, James said, leaning back in his chair. I did some digging into Elizabeth Morrison's will. She died intestate, without a will, or at least that's what the official records say. But there are references in her personal letters to a trust she established for ensuring certain futures. I think Elizabeth left money for Catherine, and Morrison destroyed the will to prevent her from ever claiming it. Sarah thought about Catherine's diary entries, about her fear and survival. She would never have tried to claim it anyway. It would have revealed where she was. Exactly. Morrison knew that too. By destroying the will, he ensured Catherine would have to choose between her inheritance and her life. He made sure she could never truly be free of him. Sarah looked at the photograph of the veiled bride, understanding now the full weight of that covered face. Catherine hadn't just been hiding her identity, she had been erasing herself to survive. But she won, Sarah said quietly. She lived free. She built a life. She married for love eventually. Morrison died, never knowing where she went. James nodded. She won. But the fact that she had to fight so hard, risk so much for basic human dignity, that's the real tragedy. Sarah returned to Columbia to meet with Eleanor Whitfield James one final time, bringing with her copies of all the documents, photographs, and diary entries she had collected. Eleanor's living room became a temporary archive as they spread Catherine's story across every available surface. I've spent my entire adult life researching my great-great-grandfather's work, Eleanor said, studying the photographs of Catherine with tears in her eyes. I knew he married couples who needed protection, but I never knew the full story of any individual wedding. To finally see her face, to know her name. Sarah handed her Catherine's diary. David Hartwell gave me permission to share this with you. He thought you should know what your ancestor helped make possible. Eleanor read several passages aloud, her voice thick with emotion. November 1895. I have been in Boston for 2 months now. The cold frightens me almost as much as the senator did. But James has been kind, and I am learning that freedom means choosing my own fear instead of living with his. I miss Mama desperately. The Brotherhood says they are working to bring her north, but I worry the senator is watching her, using her to lure me back. I will not go back. Even if it means never seeing her again, I will not return to that life. March 1896. Today I walked through Boston Common without looking over my shoulder. It was the first time since arriving that I felt like a woman instead of a fugitive. James says I should consider attending lectures at the public library. The idea terrifies and thrills me. Mrs. Morrison would be proud, I think. She always said I had a mind that deserved room to grow. August 1897. Mama arrived yesterday. I did not recognize her at first. She has aged so much in these 2 years, worn down by the senator's cruelty and her own sacrifice. But when she held me, I finally understood that I am truly free. We both are. The senator can never reach us here. Eleanor wiped her eyes. These women, Catherine, Martha, Elizabeth Morrison, they fought against an entire system designed to crush them. And they won, Sarah added. Not perfectly, not without cost, but they won. Over the next week, Sarah and Eleanor worked together to compile Catherine's story into a comprehensive historical document. They reached out to David Hartwell in Boston, to James Crawford in Charleston, and to Marcus, who helped connect them with descendants of other couples married by Reverend Whitfield. What emerged was bigger than one woman's story. It was evidence of an entire network of resistance, the Brotherhood of Providence, the ministers who broke the law, the families who protected fugitives, the merchants who provided resources, and the countless individuals who risked everything for love and dignity. Sarah wrote the final draft of her research paper late one night, the veiled wedding photograph propped beside her laptop. She had titled it, Catherine Rachel Turner Hartwell, The Face Behind the Veil. The paper documented everything. Catherine's childhood in the Morrison household, Elizabeth Morrison's defiant kindness, the rescue operation orchestrated by James Hartwell and the Brotherhood, the wedding at Providence Church, Catherine's life in Boston, her school for young black women, her eventual marriage to Dr. Thompson, and her quiet death in 1962 at age 89. But more than facts and dates, Sarah tried to capture something essential: the courage it took for Catherine to step into that church in 1895, to marry a stranger, to trust that the Brotherhood would protect her, to build a new life from nothing. Sarah ended the paper with a quote from Catherine's final diary entry, written in 1900 when she closed the journal for the last time. "I have spent 5 years looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, waiting for the senator's hand to reach north and drag me back. But today I realized he has no power here. I built a life he cannot touch, created a future he cannot control. The veil I wore on my wedding day was meant to hide me, to protect me by erasing my face, but I don't need it anymore. I am Catherine Rachel Hartwell, teacher, daughter, friend. I am visible. I am free. And I will make sure every girl who comes through my school knows she has the same right to be seen, to be known, to be free. That is my revenge against men like the senator. Not violence or anger, but visibility and education and joy. He wanted to silence me. Instead, I will make noise for the rest of my life." 3 months after completing her research, Sarah stood in a small gallery space at the Charleston Museum, preparing for the opening of a new exhibition, Hidden in Plain Sight: Interracial Love and Resistance in Post-Civil War South Carolina. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the wedding photograph, now professionally conserved and displayed behind museum glass. But beside it, finally, was a second photograph, the 1898 image of Catherine without her veil, her face clear and proud, her identity no longer hidden. Eleanor Whitfield James stood beside Sarah, along with David Hartwell, who had traveled from Boston for the opening. Together, they watched as visitors entered the gallery, drawn immediately to the paired photographs. A young woman stopped in front of the display, reading the placard that explained Catherine's story. "She was only 22, the woman whispered to her companion. "My age, and she had to marry a stranger just to survive." That was exactly what Sarah had hoped visitors would understand, not just the historical facts, but the human cost. The exhibition included Catherine's diary entries, selected correspondence from James Hartwell and the Brotherhood, Senator Morrison's Pinkerton reports, and photographs documenting Catherine's life in Boston. But it also included something unexpected: records of 17 other couples married by Reverend Whitfield between 1890 and 1899, their stories researched by Marcus and a team of genealogists. Each couple's story was unique, but the pattern was clear. Across the South, in the decades after the Civil War, thousands of people had loved to cross the color line despite laws designed to prevent it. Some marriages were secret, some were public acts of defiance. Some couples stayed hidden their entire lives, while others fought openly for recognition. David approached the display showing his great-great-grandfather's letters. James never remarried. After Catherine's legal protection was secure, he told a small group of visitors who had gathered. He could have, but he told his brother in a letter that, having helped one remarkable woman achieve freedom, I have lived a more meaningful life than most men who marry for love. He considered their arrangement his greatest accomplishment. An older black woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. My grandmother used to tell stories about a school in Boston where young black women learned to be teachers. She went there in 1905. She never said who ran it, but she always said the woman who taught there had seen things no one should see and survived with grace. Could that have been Catherine? David nodded. Catherine's school operated from 1900 to 1958. Over 500 women studied there. Your grandmother might have been one of her students. The connection, across generations, across time, was exactly what the exhibition was meant to create. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself back at the wedding photograph, studying the veiled bride one more time. She thought about Catherine standing there in 1895, terrified and brave, choosing freedom over safety, trusting strangers to protect her, stepping into an unknown future with nothing but hope. Eleanor joined her. "You gave her face back," she said quietly. "For 129 years, that veil protected her, but now we can finally see her, remember her, honor her." "She gave herself back," Sarah corrected gently. "I just told her story. She lived it." A museum docent approached with a message. "Dr. Bennett, there's someone here asking to speak with you. She says she's Catherine Thompson's great-granddaughter." Sarah's heart leaped. She followed the docent to the gallery entrance, where a woman in her 60s waited nervously. "I'm Patricia Thompson," the woman said, extending her hand. "My great-grandmother was Catherine Rachel Hartwell. I grew up hearing vague stories about her, but my family never talked about her past. We knew she came from the South, that she escaped something terrible, but she made us promise never to dig into it while she was alive. After she died, the stories faded, until I saw a news article about this exhibition." Patricia pulled a small box from her bag. "I brought something. I think it belongs here, with her story." Inside the box was a delicate silk veil, yellowed with age, but still intact. "She kept it?" Patricia said, her voice breaking. My great-grandmother kept her wedding veil for 67 years. My mother found it after she died, wrapped in tissue paper with a note. This hid my face when I needed protection. Save it for when hiding is no longer necessary. I think that time is now. Sarah accepted the veil with trembling hands. The curator carefully added it to the exhibition the next day, displayed in its own case with Catherine's note. The veil that once hid Catherine's identity became the exhibition's most powerful artifact, not because of what it concealed, but because of what its preservation revealed. Catherine had known, even in 1895, that someday her story would be safe to tell. She had waited patiently, survived quietly, and trusted that the future would be kinder than her past. As Sarah locked the museum that evening, she looked one final time at the photographs, the veiled bride and the unveiled woman, separated by 3 years and an immeasurable distance of suffering and survival. Catherine Rachel Turner Hartwell had worn a veil to save her life, but she had kept it to remember that she had once needed saving and that she had saved herself. Her face was finally visible, her story was finally told, and she would never be hidden again.